Hey, good morning, A-Pushers. Purpose of this video is to take a look at topic 9.3, the end of the Cold War here in modern America in the 1980s up to the present. We're going to kind of recap what we have talked about in class already on the 1980s and Reagan's opposition to communism, the actual dissolution of the Soviet Union, but then we're going to extend it a little bit and talk some about the consequences to those changes. So let's take a look. So what we've got here is kind of like the condensed version of the two slides that we looked at in class. So just the recap to make sure we're setting consequences, or setting context here, sorry. For Reagan's opposition to communism, there really are four big categories that the College Board puts in there. The speech and the rhetoric combined with diplomatic efforts kind of make it clear both to the American public and to the Soviet Union and the rest of the world that the United States is reinterested one more time in sort of like defeating communism as it exists. Reagan, as a true classical economist, I mean, he believes in laissez-faire capitalism, so he is going to make a strong push against the presence of communism much of anywhere and trying to amp up pressure on the Soviet Union in such a way that it's going to ultimately lead to their downfall. This is also going into this increase of military spending that Reagan is putting out there with programs like the Strategic Defense Initiative or the MX missile program, new intercontinental ballistic missiles, new types of nuclear weapons that could come into this concept of the nuclear utilization treaty, plus the idea of U.S. military interventions in small ways. This is kind of maybe sending the message to the Soviets that the United States is in fact maybe preparing for some type of greater military operation if need be. The Iran-Contra scandal kind of shows the limits of what was going on with this military intervention. So this is only like partially related into end of Cold War, but it definitely kind of fits in this topic of limited military displays. Definitely worth paying attention to what Yelp and what maybe a couple of review sources would say about the Iran-Contra affair. So when you get to the end of the Cold War here, the increased military spending is reflected in what we see on Reagan's opposition to communism, as well as his diplomatic initiatives. When you combine these two American developments with the developments in the Soviet Union, with Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika, economic restructuring, and more freedom of speech being allowed to criticize the government, there is just political pressure and economic pressure in the Soviet Union to create change, both within the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. So when Gorbachev and Reagan signed the INF Treaty in 1987, and then again when Gorbachev signs the START 1 treaty with President Bush, these are two treaties that are designed to reduce the number of nuclear weapons in the world. And then in Eastern Europe, the solidarity successes in Poland against Soviet-backed politicians, and with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and with the independence of the Soviet Republic states, including Russia, by December 25th, 1991, this means the Soviet Union kind of ceases to exist. And if the Soviet Union is one of the two big enemies in the Cold War, once they're gone, there can't really be a Cold War anymore. Therefore, you get to the end of this. But what we need to take an extra couple of minutes to look at are going to be the consequences to this, because once the Soviet Union is gone, there gets to be like just a change in the context of everything in diplomacy, combined with an increased global presence that the United States really hadn't seen in a couple of decades. So in these consequences, and this we're going to keep this one fairly short, I think, there are new diplomatic relationships that are established. The Soviet Union becomes Russia, but Eastern European nations, as they break free from the communist bloc, they start joining NATO, this organization that was created as a as a Cold War institution, is now moving into, in the 1990s and beyond, post-Cold War circumstances where it's really about trying to maintain geopolitical stability across Europe, with a new dynamic that's being involved, a little bit more of a unified Europe coming into play. This is also going to lead into development of the European Union and things that are going to have economic and political relationships with the U.S. in other ways. There are also going to be new United States military and peacekeeping interventions. And here, we're going to try to keep this focused on the 1990s. So in 1990, into the beginning of 1991, there's the Persian Gulf War, as the United States gets involved to free Kuwait from the from their occupation by Iraq and Saddam Hussein. When the U.S. gets involved in Operation Desert Storm in 1991, it is a matter of really just 3 months or so of actual fighting, and Iraq is put back in within its own borders. Kuwait has their independence maintained. This is going to have some far-reaching consequences that we'll talk about a little bit more in topic 9.6 once we get into the 21st century. More directly in Europe, there is the problems that were going on with the Yugoslav Civil War. In 1995 and then again in 1999, the U.S. sends peacekeeping forces there as Serbs and Croats and as Kosovoans, and accusations of ethnic cleansing, accusations of genocide against European Muslims in this part of the world. The U.S. intervention here is new, but it also represents part of this NATO interaction that's kind of like tried and true on one level for a U.S. presence, but it's also new so far as getting directly involved in something like this. This intervention in Yugoslavia in the 1990s is kind of controversial because, one more time, it's a civil war in an independent country with U.S. forces being in harm's way, and so there get to be questions about this being the appropriate use of military action, which gets to, like, the idea in the 21st century, continued debates over the appropriate use of U.S. power in the rest of the world. Definitely the events of 9/11 and the war on terror are going to change the dynamic on this significantly. But in the 1990s, there was some real question going on about what the United States should be doing with the rest of the world, if anything at all. Is this a chance now, after World Wars I and II, that the U.S. can kind of retreat back towards a greater level of isolationism? Is there a chance for greater cooperation around the globe without there having to be a military confrontation? These are questions that I think we're still struggling with some today, but there's 21st century history to still get into, and so I will see you in another section of these notes. Thanks for listening.